Was that an active like topic in the office? Was there like, hey, you better not talk to these guys, Meltzer?
I don't know if it was big. I mean, like with me, a lot of times, we would do interviews sometimes just based on availability for a market. We might tape an interview about what happened in a match that wasn't even going to occur for like 2 weeks. So they would have that interview to put into the, next week's show. And, I remember just being kind of told like, and you understand anything you do, you don't talk about out of school. And, I was in the kayfabe era, even from the AWA. So I think they realized they didn't have to worry about me being, telling tales out of school or, tipping off someone. So if it was big in the office, they were never worried about me doing it. So, I really didn't hear much about it.
Yeah. Bill, you guys used to print results from the shows, well after they happened. But I always wondered, the fans that are sitting there watching like a 4-week TV taping, I mean, first of all, it must be a dreadful thing to sit there through 6 hours of TV tapings and the same people coming out over and over again. But doesn't that break the magic a little bit for the people in those buildings? If you're there and you see something and you see like multiple angles on the same show, and then it being played out on TV as if it's happening organically week after week, doesn't the fan that attends that show, isn't it all lost?
How many fans are at that show when you look at the amount of fans worldwide that are seeing it on TV and not realizing that these things were, the basic fan didn't know that these shows a lot of times were taped 3 and 4 weeks in advance.
Well, when I was there, we did Poughkeepsie, every 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But if you think back on it, Bruce and Bill, as you well know, back then there was no internet, it didn't get out, and was just the fans in Poughkeepsie. But remember, this was just the earliest stage of pay-per-views. So even to a large degree, what happened on TV tapings was mostly to set up the house shows.
Right.
So not a lot of big things played out on television at the tapings before they happened at a major house show.
Right.
And a lot of times, if you look back at Superstars, sometimes, we would suddenly talk about what happened last week at Madison Square Garden or Boston Garden or Toronto and the ramifications. So not a lot of major angles broke, on TV, or if they did, the turnaround from TV to the first week was only a few days. So right. If anything like that happened, it generally was at the first week's taping.
Yeah, and
so
they didn't
air really quick.
If you really think about it, the Vince and the promoting people didn't really care. You have an audience that's there for 4 or 5 hours, and as long as they're staying there, they how are these people going to tell what's going on? Like Ken said, there's no internet back in those days, and in the magazines we were careful about. We didn't print 4 shows worth. Even though it was came out 3 months later, we would take maybe one of those 3 or 4 hours and print the results.
Yeah, and again, like if something was going to happen on TV, it almost happened in, we would tape 3 hours. It would almost always go down in the first week taping, which, it might be a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. But the turnaround in the editing, the interviews would have been done. There was a, minute 54 seconds. So a lot of times we might tape on a Wednesday, Thursday, and that show would air on Superstars in New York on Saturday. So there wasn't a lot of time where they were really needed to keep it secret.
And it wasn't sequential, right?
Do you know how they kept the audience there?
How?
By the way, by saying that at the end of the taping, the last night of the match will be Sergeant Slaughter against Hulk Hogan.
Oh, it was always
they always had a dark match to hold the fans that they
Yeah.
would stay for those shows.
Yeah.
And it wasn't sequential, right? I mean, they're post-producing that and splitting it
No,
up into
it
different.
was at least in the days of Poughkeepsie, and then we would tape in Brantford, Ontario for Canadian content. They pretty much did it, okay, week 1, it's going to be this, 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 and this, then week 2, this, and this, and then, week 3, for the most part, the matches happen sequentially. And it was one of those things, remember, that was very much the kayfabe era. So the thought was, even though it was just a couple thousand people in Poughkeepsie, they didn't really want to smarten them up. They wanted it to happen as it happened.
Right.
And I mean, they were also very conscious that, if somebody seemingly got hurt in the first week's taping, they might come back in the third week. But so in reality, in the fans' mind, okay, they've had, an hour and a half to kind of recover. So they were very much aware of everything. And to that point, far more so in WWF than AWA. They were very conscious of all of that.
Very good. Well, there you go. For all of you that were wondering how that went down, to me, it's still like I'm picturing somebody sitting there watching it, thinking that the guy rested for 2 hours, came back out, but then he watches it on TV, and the second week, he sees like Ricky Steamboat in a neck brace, acting like he can't talk. Meanwhile, they know that he came back out on the same show. But like you guys said, it's they're probably scratching their head and then thinking, oh, well, I like this stuff. So
and remember too, Bruce, back then, we didn't really do any, very few live ringside or in-ring interviews. So if someone was, got hurt and couldn't talk in week 1, they didn't come back to wrestle that night, but we could tape interviews behind the scenes with them.
Absolutely.
For like, the second week where they could barely talk, but they were really keenly aware of not doing anything that would,
insult intelligence,
to smarten anybody up.
And again, there was no internet. The internet changed the whole business.
And I mean, we would have, pre-production meetings, with everyone where they would review if they were going to do something. Well, so-and-so couldn't come back out, and then we need to do interviews for all the markets and for superstars. And you know what? We need to maybe do a generic one about how his injury is. I mean, it was, really well thought out. It wasn't willy-nilly.
Yeah, very. It's interesting to me. I mean, very interesting. And you said AWA was even more protective or less, or they weren't.
No, I'm saying, like we never had pre-production meetings in the AWA. But from day one, the first time I worked at WWF taping, involving interviews, everything else, they were on top of it. Well, okay, we did this. All right, now this is the first time in this market we're going to see so-and-so after being hurt. Okay, no, he hasn't been hurt in that market. I mean, they, and a lot of that was to, Howard Finkel was kind of the historian in terms of what had aired, what took place in what market. Always, if we'd been running a program around the territory, sometimes they would switch it up. They might put somebody else over, they might do a different finish, just, switch it up. And if the guys weren't sure, they would always, and sometime we'd have to take a quick break. Howard would go through his notes and say, okay, last time in Salt Lake, Ricky, you won because of this, but now wait a minute, in Denver, Macho Man, you won. So, I mean, they were really, really, on top of it, far more so than the, AWA.
I feel like I could cut out that entire segment and make it its own show. That's how educational it was. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at VOC Nation Wrestling Network, and follow us on Twitter at VOC Nation.